Hi, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to another edition of Breaking News of this Wednesday, the 19th day of March, part two, as we continue to look at the stories in the news that have something to do with what the Bible has to say about what our world's going to look like at the time of the end of the age before the second coming of Christ and the many events that are predicted to precede it. Now, we're going to follow up on what we said earlier this morning. We know from Scripture very clearly that Israel, Russia, Turkey, and Iran will be major players in the last days. See our book, 25 Signs. We're near the end, signs 9 and 10, which document this. Now, as far as the United States is concerned, we mentioned they are not in last days Bible prophecy. From the same book, sign 11, no superpower will intervene on Israel's behalf when they are invaded. According to Ezekiel 38:39, something will happen to the United States. Also, in our book, 45 Common Mistakes About Last Days Bible Prophecy Cleared Up, mistake 10, we make it very clear the United States is not in last days Bible prophecy. And mistake 11, the young lions of Tarshish in Ezekiel 38:13 is not referring to the United States. Now, we also mentioned that China was not in last days Bible prophecy either. They're not mentioned in Scripture. Mistakes 27 through 30, there are four common mistakes made when Revelation chapter 9, the 200 million man army, is equated with Revelation 16 or Armageddon. So four mistakes are made when you make a comparison between these two chapters and equate them. And as we say here, the fourth mistake is equating the East, the kings from the East, in John's day as a reference to the Far East, namely China and Japan. Did not refer to China and Japan in John's day. So this is why we state that Israel, Russia, Iran, and Turkey are key players at the time of the end, but US and China are not. As to why they're not, it is not stated. We just don't know. Now, what we've also mentioned, there are other players in the Bible, Libya and Sudan, who are not aligned yet with any coalition guided by Russia, but things are happening to make these nations part of the last days invading force. We've talked about this in the past. In fact, in our book, 25 Signs, we're near the end, appendix number 7, we call it Things to Come. The completion of the forming of the Ezekiel 38-39 coalition of nations that will one day invade Israel. We talk about how Libya and the Sudan are both in the process of aligning with Russia to be part of this last days coalition. So here's where we're at. The major nations, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, already aligned with some of the minor ones, moving in that direction. You really can't make this stuff up. And so this is why we mention what we do with respect to these players, and that's why we keep our eye on them. Now, interestingly, this is fascinating. We also have an update on the Syrian Christians that we've been praying for, and we heard from our friend Nodder today. First, he said this to me. He said, Don, you can't believe what country is helping the most with Syrian Christians. Now, his group is in there. He's got two different groups that are helping with the Syrian Christians. What country is helping the most with Syrian Christians? You want to guess? Think about it for a second. Who could it possibly be? If you said Israel, you'd be wrong. If you said the United States, which should be, you'd be wrong. You know which country's helping the most? It's the Russians, believe it or not. He said it's so strange, and this is what his group has found out. The Russians are actually helping the Syrian Christians here. All right. He also 16 of the 25 evil men and women. He said, yes, there are two women who are behind the killing of Christians. He said are already on standby on the other side, waiting to be judged by the Lord. In other words, they have been neutralized. All right, so there's stuff getting done there. But interesting, the Russians are actually helping the Syrian Christians. That's a newsflash. I would never have guessed that. He's shocked by it too, and so are his people. Anyway, it is also shocking that we're two women that are part of the killing group that have been eliminated now. All right, now to the headlines. So there's two of them I want to deal with today because they're both basically confirming a rumor that continues to go around, almost a truism in the unbelieving world, which is not true at all. And we want to put that to rest today. And this first headline is Israel fires back at the UN chief. We're outraged by you, Secretary General. Now, UN Secretary General Guterres is very much an anti-Semite. He continues to speak against Israel. He's very much pro-Hamas. He's very anti-Israel. And he was complaining again about Israel's response the other day to bombing Gaza again and taking out some of the middle leaders, the middle management of Hamas. And he was complaining about that and using the word genocide again. So we'll talk about this first article. Then there's a second one from the Jerusalem Post, and this is the one that really needs to be promoted, to be screamed from the rooftops, but it's not. It is the Jews, not the Palestinians, who have suffered ethnic cleansing in the past. And there's a great article from the Jerusalem Post on this. And if you're interested, you should look it up. Okay, let's look at these two headlines. Let's put it together with what we see that the Bible is saying about the time of the end. Headline number one: Israel fires back at the UN chief. We are outraged that your Secretary General, this is from Israel National News. Israel's foreign minister fires back at the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who condemned Israel's latest strikes in the Gaza Strip. And he said, they said about him, we are outraged by your moral bankruptcy. They blasted Guterres over his latest criticism of Israel's strikes on the Gaza Strip Tuesday night. Guterres had written a post on X, formerly Twitter. I am outraged by the Israeli strikes in Gaza. I strongly appeal for the ceasefire to be respected, for unimpeded humanitarian assistance to be reestablished, for the remaining hostages to be released unconditionally. In response, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Oren Mamorstein wrote, we are outraged by you, Antonio Guterres, as you are the Secretary General of the UN, United Nations. Why? Here's what he goes on to give the list. Not a word about the fact that Hamas has rejected two American proposals to extend the ceasefire and release more hostages, two proposals that Israel accepted. Not a word about the fact that Hamas exploits the transfer of goods to Gaza to rebuild its war machine in order to further attack Israel. Not a word about UNRWA, which under your leadership employs Hamas terrorists and whose facilities were used by Hamas to hold hostages. Indeed, we are outraged by your moral bankruptcy, the foreign ministry spokesman concluded. Israel launched the surprise strikes, of course, Tuesday morning after Hamas refused to release more hostages and rejected U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff's proposal. Prime Minister Netanyahu, as we mentioned this morning, addressed the nation on Tuesday evening following the surprise strike, saying, we have returned to fighting with strength on the recommendation of security officials. Now, this is a great response against the commonly stated lie, and it's a lie that the Jews are committing genocide in Gaza. In fact, not only it is a lie in the present, in the past, it has been the Jews themselves who have suffered from ethnic cleansing. And this is our second headline, and this is one, again, that needs to be shouted from the rooftops that no one ever wants to talk about. It's from the Jerusalem Post. The Jews, not Palestinians, were the ones who suffered ethnic cleansing. That's a very long article. I'm going to hit some of the snippets out of it, but I think you get the point. True ethnic cleansing is what happened to the Jews. 99% of them were driven out of their pre-Islamic communities in a single generation. On October 7, 2023, Hamas just sought to finish the job. Let me say that again. 99% of the Jews who lived in these pre-Islamic communities in the Middle East, they were driven out in a single generation, and Hamas is seeking to finish the job. 75 years ago this month, the Iraqi parliament passed a law permitting Jews to leave the country, provided that they forfeited their citizenship. In March 1951, Law 5 passed in urgent session, froze the property of Iraqi Jews stripped of their citizenship. A dozen more anti-Jewish laws were passed. Law 12 set up a secretariat to manage confiscated Jewish property. From 1951 to 1956, several decrees were passed seizing, managing, and disposing of and liquidating Jewish property. These decrees piled the pressure onto Jews still living in Iraq. A recent report by Justice for Jews from Arab countries, JJAC, valued the lost assets and property of the Iraqi Jews at $34 billion at today's prices. Let me read that sentence again. A recent report by the Justice for Jews from Arab countries, the JJAC, valued the lost assets and property of the Iraqi Jews at $34 billion at today's prices. Back in 1949, little did the Iraqi government realize that almost the entire community would register to go. The departing Jews were issued with a document as they boarded the airlift to Israel. It was effectively an expulsion order. Expecting at most an exodus of 14,000 Jews, the regime did not imagine that Iraq would be emptied of them. But Jews had been so desperate to flee the country that they were risking heavy prison sentences in order to illegally cross the border into Iran. Iraq was hemorrhaging 1,000 Jews per month and their money. The regime had declared a war on Israel, introduced draconian emergency laws against its own Jewish citizens, persecuted Zionists and communists, and banned Jews from higher education, jobs, and travel, and had executed Iraq's wealthiest and best connected non-Zionist Jew, Shafiq Aziz, on trumped-up spying charges. Most worrying of all, the Jews feared a second deportation, the massacre of 1941, that claimed almost 200 Jewish lives. President Donald Trump's suggestion that Gazans be moved out has been greeted with a chorus of disapproval, not the least from well-meaning liberal Jews. But it is forgotten that transfer is not a new idea, that it has only ever been applied to Jews and Jews alone. The Israeli foreign minister, Moshe Sharett, initially refused any possible linkage between the two sets of refugees. The Israeli government thought it was a cynical ploy to seize the abandoned property of Iraqi Jews. The British ambassador at the time reported that a population exchange was acceptable to Israel in principle. But the idea of exchanging, now get this, 100,000 homeless Palestinian refugees for 100,000 Jewish refugees who would leave their assets behind was seen in Israel as extortion. It certainly was. As it turned out, Iraq was bent on legalizing the dispossession of the Jewish community in any case. Some 130,000 Iraqi Jews fled to Israel. Only 7,000 Palestinian refugees arrived in Iraq. By 1970, all the Arab countries had disgorged almost 1 million Jews. Let's read that again. By 1970, all the Arab countries in the Middle East had disgorged almost 1 million Jews, most of whom arrived destitute in Israel, stripped of their citizenship and assets. Jews from Arab and Muslim countries and their descendants now form over half of Israel's Jews. So the article completes by saying the charge of ethnic cleansing is habitually leveled at the Jewish state, although the Palestinian Arab population never ceases to rise. But true ethnic cleansing is what happened to the Jews, 99% of whom were driven out of their pre-Islamic communities in a single generation. Again, on October 7, 2023, Hamas just sought to finish the job. So this truth, which is rarely, if ever, talked about, should be front and center in the discussion of the eventual fate of those living in Gaza. And we're planning to write about this subject by adding another appendix to one of our books on Bible prophecy, because it's a real important truth that should be declared far and wide. There's a number of books I have in my library that are rare. They're older books, but go into it in great detail about what happened in real time in the 1940s, 1950s, and such like with the Jews in the Middle East before the modern state of Israel was formed. So again, this lie about genocide, about ethnic cleansing, again, just the opposite is true. It's the Jews who have been ethnically cleansed. It's the Jews where these Arab nations, these Muslim nations have tried to commit genocide against them. And so Gutierrez, in saying this as the head of the UN, the Secretary General, is absurd, and he needed to be rebuked. And thank God this Israeli official rebuked it. Anyway, that's the latest today. Hopefully all that was helpful. I'm Don Stewart. We'll see you again tomorrow for another edition of Breaking News. Until then, may the Lord, as always, richly, richly bless.